The Peach. I hope you're doing well. I'm getting here, listen to some Manly P. Hall. This thing don't want to act right today. Hold tight, family.
These non-counted days, or days that were not in the calendar, were set aside to the worship of the gods, and thus came into existence as a group of festivals, or of ceremonies, rituals, and rites, which have continued down to us from one culture to another. In the course of time, we have altered these days as to their meaning and the events which they celebrated. But the habit or practice of preserving these great festival days has not to any measure altered or changed. I think the interesting point of symbolism is that the Egyptians held that the great principles of nature and of heaven were assigned to these days as the birthdays of deities. This meant that the gods were not born in any year, were not born in any temporal calendar whatsoever, and were thus properly represented as beings of eternity, outside of our general concept of time. The timelessness of these deities was thus symbolically established, and the worship of them was held to be beyond the ordinary concerns of men who measured their barter and trade and their months and years by an ordinary calendar. This universality of a concept tells us something that is useful to us even in our present generation, namely that there are principles beyond time. There are principles beyond our measurement or estimation, and there are beings and powers in nature which cannot be captured within our concepts of time and place. These eternal principles were anciently venerated, and we seek to perpetuate in our way the principles for which these eternal powers were the most primitive and antique symbols. Of these great and mysterious days set aside for the worship of truth in all of its phases and aspects, that which we refer to now as Christmas was an ancient and accepted festival, sometimes referred to as the birthday of the sun god. This worship of these days has a number of meanings. Perhaps we can explore a few of them in terms of their present utility. Let us not, therefore, devote too much time to historical factors or to the eternal conflicts of human belief, but strive to find what these ceremonies can mean to us as thoughtful persons living in our present century and generation. In the first place, the trend in modern thinking, particularly on the level of social psychology, is the re-evaluation of what might be termed the idea and ideal archetypes of humanity. There are great thoughts that we share, thoughts that have been often obscured in times of benightedness, but have been restored in emergency and under periods of great stress and pressure, by which we have been forced back into the recognition of basic value. We are being so forced today by circumstances that weigh heavy upon us. The great problem of our generation is confusion. And confusion is something under which the average person cannot function adequately. To meet the challenge of confusion, we instinctively seek value. We strive once more to discover essential landmarks. We seek road marks and guides by means of which we can continue a reasonable course, even under the pressure of unreasonable conditions. In this search for value, basic archetypal pattern, it has been observed from the beginning of our experience as human beings that we have always sought consolation and value on the level of basic idea, basic principle. Our only hope has always been that there is a universal truth, that there is a power at the source and root of existence, which is honorable, true, right, good. Without this basic conviction, no civilization has ever been able to restore itself or raise itself above a comparatively savage state. As this conviction has grown dim, cultures have failed. And in every instance, a new culture springing into existence has attained its vitality by restoring this concept of truth, of an eternal principle of reality, toward which we must turn and to which we must periodically rededicate our lives. In order that such dedication may exist, all peoples have set aside days for the celebration of principles. These principles may be either abstract, religious, spiritual, or the manifestation of this power or these powers in the persons of heroes or in circumstances by which we feel that we can recall or revitalize important occasions based in this truth concept. In our own Western way of life, for example, we have not only sacred holidays, but also secular holidays. In all cases, however, the secular holiday is in some way an extension of an ideal or a principle into our daily life. When we celebrate, for example, the declaration of our independence on the 4th of July, we are really celebrating a principle by means of which our nation was brought into fortunate existence. We are celebrating the unselfishness, the dedication, the courage of our forefathers. We are celebrating their strength in right, as it was given to them to understand the right. And we celebrate this day because we believe it was a day that was lawful, that it was right in nature and right in spirit, and that those who helped to bring it about exemplified in their conduct the very principles which we most deeply admire. Thanksgiving is another day in which we recognize the importance of gratitude, which is an aspect of truth. We attempt to express this symbolically through restoring a vision of gratitude and to be restated within our own natures as a fact to give us encouragement and hope for the years that lie ahead. We celebrate the birthdays of our great heroes as Washington and Lincoln. We celebrate the sacrifice of our young men in war and in death in order to preserve the principles which we hold sacred. We celebrate the rights of labor. We celebrate the new year. And we keep all of these festivals because in them we find symbolic monuments of principles that we affirm to be right and proper. Thus, even our secular occasions have about them a certain sacredness, because they again are merely our way of recognizing the workings of the law in nature and in human nature. And gradually we elevate to recognition, respect, even almost worship those in whose lives truth has been the guiding and leading power. Thus, regardless of our confusions and our insecurities, we inwardly recognize that we are under the sovereignty of a pattern, a plan, a purpose that is essentially right. We also recognize that this purpose is continually obscured in the courses of our daily actions. We recognize our own limitations, and we realize that our selfishness, short-sightedness, and materiality may in many instances deprive these festivals of their deeper significance. Yet we also know that as individuals, we have the right to call forth out of ourselves whatever degree of understanding we may possess, and therefore that we cannot actually affirm that the profaning of a holiday makes it necessary for us to profane it. That the fact that others do not understand is no excuse why we should condemn either the event or even perhaps those who exploit the event. It is for us as persons to seek our securities by the restatement of our own understanding. And regardless of the direction or course of empire, each individual has the right to seek within, in quietude, in peace, and in gratitude, for the source of light, and the source of strength, the source of value in this troubled world. Modern thinkers are beginning to realize that in the prosaic attitudes which they have held, in their general disregard for this sensitivity in man, they have worked a hardship upon human nature. That in the attempt to impose a blanket materialism upon life, they have deprived man of values which are necessary to him. It may not be well to say that they have actually deprived us of these values, because we cannot be deprived of them any more than we can be deprived of life itself and still survive. Yet we have gradually come to interpret out of these events the solemnity and meaning which they held, until today our festivals become almost a burden upon our flesh. We no longer sense the possibility, the need, and the reality of these important occasions. It is often true that under the pressure of events, our spiritual insight is not always available to us. And just as surely as we need a vacation every year, or we need that annual medical checkup, or we need a certain reunion with our friends and families, so also we need periodically the spiritual remedy of the restatement of our faiths. This restatement is made convenient for us, easy and comparatively simple, by these festivals which set aside times particularly proper and appropriate for such restatement. We may sometimes believe with the scoffer that it is sad indeed that we have to have one Mother's Day a year, that we cannot make our understanding and our appreciation stretch over the whole year. Actually, however, if in that day of recognition we have a deep experience of value, we shall find that our attitudes do stretch better, that we will be able to carry a certain lingering remembrance through the entire year. Therefore, these periods of restatement are not the substitution for a good life. They are continual restatements of the reason for a good life. They help us to have courage to face each coming day with greater internal personal resource. Thus, as we look around us all over the world and observe these archetypal days, we realize that they rise primarily from the archetype in ourselves, which in turn is based upon a universal pattern. Man could not have these rhythms of motion in his own consciousness if this consciousness was not rooted in a universal rhythm. The fact that we instinctively perform certain actions will in itself testify to the validity of the motivation behind the more noble and beautiful of these actions. They arise out of something beyond ourselves. And I think we cannot say that we merely copy these habits from each other, because somewhere in the dim source of things there was nothing to copy from. And yet man still, out of his own nature and out of his own instincts, created these patterns. Today, in various primitive parts of the world where civilization or even organized religion have scarcely penetrated, these festivals are observed and have been since the dawn of time among the most isolated and remote cultural groups. Thus, they represent a spontaneous release from ourselves. And I think this morning we are concerned primarily with one of these forms of internal release. The release of something which perhaps we do not fully appreciate or understand, but which challenges us and causes us to sense the overimportance. Perhaps this is the reasons why we resent the profaning of these days, why we are peculiarly disillusioned when human beings seemingly exploit these most tender and most profound instincts of our lives. Yet this very exploitation may help us, because it will help us to restore the value which seemingly disappears. And in our rebellion against exploitation, we may clarify the essential principle and restore it in our own natures and in our own souls. Christianity, as the religion of Western man, has always been rich in festivals. In fact, the calendar of Christian festivals includes in some part of Christendom practically every day of the year. In many nations, there are more religious festivals than we observe. And in many parts of the world, a major religious festival may be said to occur at least once weekly. In some places, even oftener. Most of these festivals are, as in the case of secular celebrations, either surrounding spiritual convictions or else in recognition of the achievement of human beings themselves, who have attained extraordinary sanctity by their way of life and have thus become worthy of veneration, and perhaps through the great machinery of the ancient church were actually raised to sainthood or to some position approximate to the nature of a divine being. All of these various festivals have their importance in moderating and directing the conduct of persons who must live largely by the glorification of example, who must gain their own courage from the realization that other persons have kept faith even under the most harrowing conditions. So each of these festivals reminds us of a virtue, reminds us of some quality or some person in whom value has been very clearly and definitely expressed. As these festivals disappear or retire from among us, we lose, therefore, a certain foundation in principles, and we begin to substitute the mere celebration of external situations. We begin to use these days merely as days of leisure, or perhaps as excuses for some kind of secular festivity. To this degree, we have lost an inner contact. Perhaps this contact does remain subconsciously in us, but it is not as available as it should be for the end which it is most intended to attain, namely a re-encouragement of ourselves, a recognition or restoration of hope, of faith, of love, of friendship, and of understanding. Let it not be said, however, that the profaning of these days can interfere with this. It will interfere only to the degree that we permit it to, and in our own lives we can live as well as we wish to live. We can be as true as we wish to be, and there is no real value or merit in the excuse that the profaning of these festivals causes us to become disillusioned in them. We may become a little disillusioned in our way of life, but we cannot be disillusioned in principles, because these stand whether they are recognized or ignored. And whatever action is performed in their name in no way changes them. It only changes our attitude toward them. And the restoration of our own attitude is very important. It is scarcely a day goes by in which we do not contact persons who are disillusioned, whose internal attitudes are weakened. And these individuals are in desperate need of some kind of encouragement. They wander from one to another seeking this encouragement, but must ultimately recognize that it arises in their own natures, that it cannot be forced upon them, that it cannot be communicated to them in substance. They must find it. And each of these great festivals is a day of encouragement for the individual to find the principles and restate them, principles that he needs in order to live as a common, well-organized member of our present society. And by common we mean not in the sense of the dignity of nature, but things held in common, or held in common good, which is a very important concept, which semantically has become badly confused and distorted. And so we turn to our Christian symbols to see if we can understand something more of this principle we seek. And whether it be in our own faith or in other faiths, nearly all religion is founded upon the building of a valid concept of hope. The individual must live in a world in which he has some basic belief. He has to feel within himself that the power at the root of life is moving life victoriously toward a proper end. That human beings may conceal this end or may work against it, but that the end itself is inevitable, and that therefore we have continuing inducement to keep principles and keep faith, with the full recognition that these principles must ultimately succeed. In spite of their obscuration, they will come forth, and they will be manifested in this world to the degree that we are capable of retaining and sustaining them in our own conduct. In this way, therefore, the principle of universal hope has been sustained by the honoring of the birthday of the noblest of beings. And in Christendom, this is the birthday of the Christian Messiah. It is in this concept that we honor to our best degree that which has been best among us. we hold the life of Jesus to be a representation, an archetypal example of the way of life for Christendom. We recognize in the strength, the courage, the simplicity, and the constant and eternal love of this person the highest virtues and values which we attempt to exemplify. We hold this, therefore, to be the celebration of our archetypally perfect being, the being which in our own estimation is the person we would most like to be like, the person who has shown us in personal conduct, in all the vicissitudes of life, that strength and nobility of nature, which to us is most commendable. Let us pause, therefore, and say to ourselves, could a world made up of millions, hundreds of millions of persons, in every walk of life, many of them to our minds strangers and unbelievers, could this concept have survived not only the 19.5 centuries of Christendom, but also in principle, thousands of years prior to this, under other names, under other concepts, but always essentially the same principle? Would man have held this festival? Would he have regarded it as important and perpetuated it down through the ages, unless inside of himself he honestly and sincerely appreciated the principle for which it stands? If this festival had been contrary to his own instincts, if this festival had not received his support psychologically, it could not have endured. It would have been completely impossible for Christmas to have had meaning for us for 1900 years if the being celebrated upon this day was not, to our mind, the kind of being we want to be. Had it been any other way, it would have perished in limbo. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Roman Caesars were regarded as embodiments of deity. The Caesars were gods, and days were set aside for the celebration of them. These days have perished in limbo. No one cares anything about them. The Caesars were not gods. The Sermon on the Mount is perhaps one of the most difficult parts of the New Testament for the average person to accept as a code of conduct. From the earliest times when this code was promulgated, it came into direct conflict with the prevailing policies of the time. There has been a great deal of discussion, particularly in the last 50 years, as to the relationship of this code to ancient Judaistic law in a determination or effort to decide whether or not in this code Jesus was speaking on the authority of the elders of Jerusalem or in conflict with this authority. Jewish rabbis today are inclined to feel that this code is also acceptable to the Orthodox Jew, and that therefore it is within the province of a rabbi teaching 2,000 years ago. Therefore, we have another acceptance uniting the two principal faiths that are found within the structure of the Holy Bible. Most persons feel that the Sermon on the Mount is simply unlivable. They mostly agree that it would be a wonderful thing if we could live it. that it represents perhaps the highest concept of religious ethics that the world knows. But it is so lofty in its concept and so severe in its statements that the average individual feels that it has to be modified in some way. Perhaps the answer lies in trying to understand the perspective of this sermon in relationship to the people of the time. It is obvious from the opening introductory section that Jesus, having passed into this mountainous place, gathered his disciples around him, and also in the presence of a multitude of persons, delivered this sermon. Incidentally, the original sermon probably did not contain all of the elements now incorporated into it. It was built up from other statements which he made, which have a bearing upon the key thought or substance of the sermon, which is righteousness. There is something, therefore, to suggest that the sermon was directed primarily toward the disciples. Jesus is assumed to have known that these disciples were going forth as lambs among wolves, that they were going to promulgate a doctrine that would bring upon themselves persecution and, in most instances, martyrdom. It is quite conceivable, therefore, that he gave them certain extremely strict injunctions, which they were to follow as examples of the faith which he taught. He seems to have felt that if they did not live this doctrine, they would be unable to influence others to do so. Also, in this series of statements, which we call the Beatitudes, he protects the disciples in most instances from any reasonable objection that could be raised against them by the pagan world into which they were going. He taught them humility. He taught them to avoid controversy of all kinds. He taught them to stand firm, placing the values of the Spirit above all temporal considerations. If we therefore assume that this code was first intended for those who constituted a small minority group and must protect their destinies against the pressures of criticism and condemnation, if we see this in the pattern, it will help us to understand the sermon perhaps a little more completely. Also, as the world has progressed generation after generation, Christian mysticism has risen to take its place among the great mystical systems of the world. I think the Sermon on the Mount particularly invites our consideration in terms of comparative religion. There are many phases of it, for example, that could not be clarified in terms of Christian orthodoxy. Most of the extremely conservative groups must face a completely literal application of the words of Jesus. To the mystic, however, there is another world, a world of internal value. And it is only in this inner world that man is really free to be himself, to live the things that are closest to his soul. In the inner world of his own consciousness, man can completely Christianize his way of life. He can become entirely dedicated to a code or a creed which might not be socially entirely acceptable. From this point of complete inner dedication and devotion, He may therefore permit his inner life to shine out through a series of quietudes of conduct, which should not in themselves produce any very grave complications in his own affairs. The great mistake has been, probably, and it has been a common mistake in most religions and a prevalent one among early Christian groups, the great mistake has always been to apply the code or the creed primarily to other people first, to demand of other persons a conduct, and to criticize or condemn them for lack of ability to live up to such a credo. If, however, instead of trying to impress this morality upon our neighbor, we apply it first to ourselves, we may then find that much of the general objection, of the public mind at least, is immediately relieved. We do know, and every mystic realizes, that we can live as we please, as an experience of our own consciousness. When we compare the Sermon on the Mount with the revelations of other mystics, not any longer with the Orthodox creeds, but with other mystical beliefs, we discover it far more acceptable, closer to the world concept of man's own inner life. Certainly it is very close to the doctrines of the Sufi, a very harmless group of people. It would certainly be in the spirit of the ancient Essenian teaching, a community with which we have become suddenly much more interested as a result of the Dead Sea Scrolls problem. We also see many parallels between this sermon and Buddhist mysticism. And there's no doubt that a book could be written on Zen and the Sermon on the Mount. These other systems, in their mystical simplicity, come very close to this concept. And we find much of it in the beautiful prose poetry of Kahil Gibran. This mystical point of view, cutting through and transcending the so-called reasonable ways of doing things, reveals also the mystical consummation that man is capable of a degree of insight in which that which seems possible only to his mystical senses can become possible in his full and total life. Another point that I believe is valid in this consideration is the fact that mysticism, by its very development within man, causes certain changes in himself by which all things become possible, and that which to the objective mind is inconceivable can to the subjective not only be conceived, but respected, acknowledged, and sustained. A great deal, therefore, depends upon the flow of psychic energy within the person as to whether he is able to face a challenge as great and as positive as the one involved in the Sermon of Jesus. There are many different ways in which we can approach this very beautiful sermon. But in this present generation in which we live, there are points that perhaps will help to clarify the basic concept. If man lived in this world a total and complete existence, if man faced an eternity of continuance here in this world alone, if the universe consisted only of those natural laws with which we are acquainted in science, then perhaps the entire problem of the Sermon on the Mount would be beyond us and among the abstractions of possibility. But each individual lives not only in a material world, of which he is a citizen for a certain number of years, but he lives in a larger world, a world of consciousness. And about the laws of this world, he knows comparatively little. Even today, the researchers in psychology have brought us only to certain subjective phases of man's mental and emotional life. We have not yet penetrated through into the spiritual root of man. We do not know actually the rules governing his universal citizenship. We do not know what his relationship to eternity and space and spirit actually are. This relationship or group of relationships must be clarified in some way if we are to meet the challenge of our time. It is quite conceivable and possible, therefore, that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking to us about universal relationships. Relationships which have a bearing upon our universal destiny, and perhaps reminding us, as we sometimes remind ourselves, that our achievements here do not guarantee us an acceptable life in space. That even though we keep all the rules of our existing society, we must in full time depart from this society into another kind of life. In this other kind of life, most of the things we know here are no longer applicable. And whether we regard the possibility of reincarnation or not, it is certain that a great part of our existence is not lived in this kind of a world. And also that regardless even of this factor, the very world we live in now is changing. And if as citizens of space, we should return here 1,000 years from now, later 2, 5, 10,000 years from now, that we will come back into a different dimension of life than that which we now know. Perhaps, therefore, in our sermon, we are dealing with a universal code that we have not yet learned to experience, but which must come and which must ultimately dominate our way of life. If, therefore, this sermon deals with an eternal nature of ourselves, with patterns of conduct that must ultimately be met if we are ever to have peace, security, and goodwill among men, then it is certainly valuable for us to think about these things as deeply and as honestly and as sincerely as we can. I believe that in a sense we get certain consolation from some of the Eastern philosophies relating to this problem. These philosophies are willing to admit that at this time man probably cannot live according to the fullness of any spiritual revelation. He does, however, possess the internal power to know that such revelation exists. He also has the internal integrity which causes him to hope, to wish, and to feel that this inner revelation is right, even though he cannot fully meet its challenge. I'm inclined, therefore, to feel that the most important practical thing for us to do is to move in the direction of the grand concept of this sermon, admitting even as we progress that we will not be perfect in the fulfillment of these various rules. Perhaps, therefore, in a Socratic sense, we must first seek moderation. We must depart from such excess as we can gradually overcome in our own natures. We must come nearer and nearer to the value that we know to be right. We will occasionally fail. In some matters we may fail more than occasionally. But still, if we sincerely endeavor, we will discover that even a small achievement brings a marked and measurable result. If we are able to control ourselves even to a degree, the life we live and our association with other persons will be ennobled and enriched. Thus, perhaps, instead of taking the attitude that it must be all or nothing, we should take the attitude of recognizing the need of growing up in a spiritual consciousness, moving step by step away from those values which we know are not right to those values which we know are right, and keeping ever clear in consciousness the vision of that which is ultimately right. Thus, by degrees, through the modification of conduct, we are able to attain greater and greater internal integration. We have already learned from psychology that merely battling with fixations and complexes will not end our psychic problem. That there is no use seeking a temporary adjustment. It may, of course, have certain immediate helpfulness, but it is not solutional. The only solutional thing that can happen to us is that we grow gradually toward the truth that we know is right. And as we grow, perhaps gradually, naturally, and without too much pressure and tension, we do achieve by degrees these ends which we know to be necessary. Also, by natural processes of growth, we not only decrease the negative factors of the personality, but we also gain further strength from within ourselves to advance this growth. Perhaps at the beginning we have very little strength and a great deal of obstacle. But as we proceed, strength increases and obstacle decreases. So it is necessary to make some beginning. And certainly in the Sermon on the Mount, we have wonderful suggestions as to how this beginning can be made. And in the particular summary, of course, of the Beatitudes, we have a very clear creed of attitudes that are right. And most of these attitudes do appeal to us. And most of these attitudes would be, in the end, the kind that would bring us to quietude. The whole purpose, it seems to me, of this sermon is to help the individual to remove from his experience the disorder, the discontent, and the inconsistency, which together lead to trouble. Several books have been written by mystics and modern religionists, pointing out the importance of the Sermon on the Mount as a psychotherapeutic document. It is admitted that if man had this attitude within himself, sickness would be less common. The problems of daily existence would be less severe, and the tribulations and miseries which seem to flow in upon us would be less numerous. Actually, the internal integration of the person is his only strength against the pressure and confusion of the outside world. And in the type of situation that has arisen in the last few years of world experience, we have begun to recognize again that each individual must make his own private peace with reality. We can no longer assume that we can move along with great concourses of persons to some grand religious end. Such motion as there is in the collective must be due to the stressful effort of the individual. It is therefore a very important thing today to conceive of how we would act if we were in a fallout shelter under bombardment. We hope we never will be. But if this world as we know it was rocking around us, if our own futures could be measured maybe only in hours or days, with what security of inner life would we meet this? Such security must be our basis of religion. It must be a religion based upon some deep, sympathetic rapport with universal values that cannot be destroyed by man's inhumanity to man. We need this inner integration. And the only way that we can possibly obtain it is through increasing thoughtfulness within ourselves, a renewed determination to have in our own lives a faith that is stronger than emergency. Many persons believe they have this. Some do not believe. Some who believe they have it probably do not. Some who do not believe they have it probably do, under the pressure of situation. Individuals whom we might not immediately regard as religious may face these emergencies better than we do. But whatever be the level of the person, it is certainly some strong internal conviction that must carry him through the emergency of the day. Now we come to think of something such as a possible nuclear war as a unique disaster. It is unique probably in the number of persons who would be involved, but it is not unique in terms of the disaster in the life of each individual, because his own problems are always his disaster. And it is not possible to say that there is a great difference between an individual who is destroyed by nuclear fission or an individual who is destroyed on the freeway by a careless driver. Both persons make their departure from this way of life. Each must face the same transition, whether it occurs to himself alone at that moment or whether it occurs to millions of persons simultaneously. Each person must face this mystery alone, supported and sustained only by his own resources. I believe the Sermon on the Mount is concerned with this mystery of meeting the inevitable, meeting that which changes instantly our entire outlook toward value, meeting an emergency in which what we have becomes meaningless and what we are becomes all meaningful. And in that kind of an emergency, and we must all face it, whether there be war or no war, or whether there be revolutions or no revolutions, we must each face the transition from a familiar way of life with its own peculiar little world and that great way of life, which is the motion of consciousness itself in the infinite. Jesus tries to give us this understanding in the creation of his two worlds, the world which belongs to Caesar and the world which belongs to God. And he clearly tells us that we must render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but we must reserve for God those things which belong to God. A certain part of our outer life here certainly belongs to Caesar, but our inner life, the eternity of consciousness in our own souls, belongs to God, always has and always will. Therefore, we have two codes we must live by. And if we must in some way decide that we cannot reconcile these two codes, then we must try the best we can to cling to that code which is the more important. And there seems to be no reasonable question that the most important code in all the world is that which will cause us to cling to truth, cling to reality, and be acceptable in the light of that divine power which is our source and substance.
Mental tenets. Neoplatonism may appear to be a mass of speculations interspersed with the extravagant flights of fancy. Such a viewpoint, however, ignores the institutions of the mysteries, those secret schools into whose profundities of idealism nearly all of the first philosophers of antiquity were initiated. When the physical body of pagan thought collapsed, an attempt was made to resurrect the form by instilling new life into it, by the unveiling of its mystical truths. This effort apparently was barren of results. Despite the antagonism, however, between Prst